G'day everyone, Lauren Kress, the business scientist here. I'm doing something a little bit different today. I recently came across a discussion between Russel Brand and Brené Brown on Under the Skin, which is a show that I absolutely love by Russel Brand. He interviews some amazing experts, and Brené Brown is probably a woman I look up to most in the world. I think she is awesome. And this interview is great. There's a lot of amazing concepts discussed, and I highly, highly recommend checking it out. But there was one point in the discussion that atheism was kind of associated with nihilism in a way that just isn't true of all atheists everywhere. So as someone who would identify as an atheist, I mean, if you want to say I was an agnostic atheist, that would be fine as well. I wanted to kind of discuss some of the problems with this and some of the assumptions, I guess, that are made in order to put forward the arguments that they put forward in this part of the interview. So I'm only going to look at part of the discussion because the whole discussion goes for like an hour and 20 minutes. So just going to look at a few minutes where they're specifically talking about this. And of course, I'd encourage you to go and watch the whole thing for yourself as well. I'm also going to look at Russel Brand references another interview that he had with Brian Cox. And there was a bit of a misinterpretation of what science is and how science sees God, sort of like these opposing ideas, when actually, as Brian Cox says, science is something that can't really look at the existence of God yet. Anyway, we kind of say we don't know. That's the position that science is in. We can't test this. We don't know. So I'm just going to hit play and let's kind of talk through this.
I have really been able to be with people that I've said, I think you're right. It's easier for sure with clergy or easier with people that believe in God. But I have been able to say to people, because I've done this with like 1,000 people in a room, write down the name and then what if the universe, what if, but if you have no connection to anything larger than you, because it doesn't work.
Because if you're,
it doesn't work.
If you're that transition, the vocabulary transition from God to universe, you're still accepting the idea of an omnipotent entity that knows all, and being open to the possibility that you could be communicated to in that way. I even think I spoke for a lot. He comes up all the time, so it must have really affected me. And this dude that's an astrophysicist, and I really, really like him actually. He's called Brian Cox. He's a very sort of TV astrophysicist, right? I like him. But he's an atheist, or he said, initially he says, I'd never identify as an atheist because I never liked everything. But that thing that's in your thing, if it can't be measured, it's not there. That came up, right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Right? So, and I feel like, how can you ever say that with the limitations of the senses? We've only got these limited instruments to judge stuff with. Do you think that our capacity for knowledge and knowledge are the same thing? Or is it possible that our capacity for knowledge is this
tiny
and knowledge is that?
Yeah.
So everything we're judging is taking place on a fucking pinhead.
Yeah, on a pinhead. It's really Kansas dust in the wind.
So I want to be clear here. Brian Cox didn't say that because we can't measure it, therefore it doesn't exist. He said because we can't measure it, or because we don't have the tools in science to look at this, we don't know. Our answer is we don't know. And that's often the answer for a lot of things in science. It's not some sort of dogma or doctrine that says that God can't exist. It's saying that with the tools that we have, which we admit are limited as scientists, we can't see any evidence for God existing. So I think it's really important to think about this in terms of there's so many things that we're atheists about. We're atheists about, I always use the example of, because one of the professors at my university used this example of the tooth fairy, prove the tooth fairy doesn't exist. Science can't really do that. But everyone, tends to accept that the tooth fairy doesn't exist, which is why it's a good example. The idea of there being an omnipotent being, well, we just can't test that. And that's what Brian Cox said. So I'm just going to go over to that interview and kind of talk through that a little bit as well. And then we'll come back to the Russel Brand and Brené Brown one.
That we don't have absolute truths in science. We don't think we know anything for certain. And we are humble with the way that we approach nature. And crucially, that our opinion counts for nothing in the face of nature. If we can be shown to be wrong. And we should be delighted when we're shown to be wrong, because it means we've learned something. And that's at the heart of the scientific endeavour. And he felt those things could be translated from science to politics and the way that we run societies. And then if we do that, we would have the wisdom to control the power.
This is a very beautiful ideology, isn't it? And it's sort of not underwritten by, well, as you say, like the idea of approaching nature with humility, with grace, with an understanding of our own limitations, seems to me like a spiritual doctrine that should be used in precisely in politics, in domestic familial life. This is sort of, for me, that is almost a universal idea, that we approach nature with love and compassion. Because obviously what I was very curious about, well, one of the reasons I wanted to meet you is because I respect you enormously. I respect what you've done, and the breadth of knowledge that you have and the way that you've conveyed it is awesome. But I know that as a man of science that you are sort of famously atheistic, is that right?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, I reject the label because I think that it's divisive. And so I genuinely think that science does not rule out the existence of a creator by definition, because we don't know how the universe began. Full stop. That's it. We don't know. Right? We have a theory of what might have happened before the Big Bang, a theory called inflation, which says that the universe was still around but doing something else. But we're still left with the question, how did that start? How did the universe have a beginning? And if so, how did it begin? The answer is we don't know, full stop. So you can't read it. So from the scientific perspective, it is wrong to say that science has anything to say at all about the nature of a creator, or the can be, because we don't know. That's
yes.
It. Now, all I say is that I don't personally have any faith. I don't have a personal faith. Now, and we can dig into that.
Do you mean faith as in pre-existing ideological structure that you used as a framework for your understanding of reality, or do you mean faith, a sort of an inward belief that there is beauty and great? Because when you said that humility and all that, that sounded like a faith.
Well, yeah. So I suppose it depends, and you could talk about this more actually. How you define the word. I mean, to me, all I mean when I say that is I don't have a religion that I adhere to. I don't. I do not know what the origin of the laws of nature is, and that's enough for me.
Yeah,
I don't really, I don't feel compelled. I'd love to know, but I don't feel compelled to go further than the statement that I don't know. And I think I said in one of my books, that's one of the greatest of mysteries. We are part of the greatest of mysteries, and for me, that's enough.
Yes,
Full
yes.
stop.
It's really important to understand that science isn't saying that God does or doesn't exist. It's just saying that it's not something that we can look at. This is a mystery. It's not something we can put under the microscope and understand. We can put lots of things under the microscope. We can test lots of things, but we can't test this. And so belief in a creator or a God does require a leap of faith. Many things require a leap of faith. And it's very hard as someone who doesn't see any evidence, for me, to make that leap of faith. I can't force myself to believe something. I don't think we get a choice on what we believe necessarily. We look at the evidence as scientists, and some physicists, some scientists do believe that there was a creator, but it takes that leap of faith. There's nothing wrong with taking that leap of faith. And that's not something that I think a lot of atheists have a problem with. The problem that I have with religion is when it is used to control people, when it is used as a dogma. And if science is used as a dogma, I have the same issues. It's the fact that it's being used to control people and their behavior instead of allowing them to think freely and explore ideas freely as an individual. So if someone believes in God, it doesn't mean that they can't be a scientist. But it's really important to acknowledge that that doesn't come from science, that it comes from a belief. It is a leap of faith. Now, I want to go back to Brené Brown and Russel Brand's discussion, because this is the main issue that I have with the way that they talked about atheism, and sort of they make this logical leap to nihilism. So let's have a look at that and talk through that.
So everyone has some sort of faith in, like, beyondness. No? Oh, right, you've done the research. I'm just guessing.
Now,
I've done some good guesses on this.
No, not everyone has. I mean, like, I define spirituality as the belief in the inextricable connection between human beings and something that's grounded in love and goodness. I mean, that's how I describe spirituality.
So I love that. I love Brené Brown's definition of spirituality. And I think that there is no need to believe in God to have that belief that we are tied together as a species. In fact, that's something that I think science kind of shows as well. And science helps us appreciate that in terms of how similar we all are and yet how different we can all be as well. So as a scientist, I feel like that's actually something that I appreciate more, because I have some tools and some knowledge, and I'm always learning more about nature and how we're connected. But for me, that has nothing to do with taking a leap of faith and believing in God.
For me, it's God. For my dad, it's fishing, like whatever, like nature.
Okay, so here she mentions that for her dad, it's fishing. So it seems to be what she's saying, that you can not believe in God, but you have this inextricable link between humans, and that's part of where you get your meaning from. Let's have a look at what she says next, though.
But there are people that don't have that. But let me tell you, I've peered into that abyss. I want no part of that darkness.
I can't go down there ever again.
So here's the thing, right? Not having any sort of sense of spirituality or connectedness to other humans or other things like nature, that's not what atheism is. That would be something that a lot of us would see as nihilism. So what Brene Brown's talking about there in not having this sense of spirituality isn't necessarily that all atheists are like this, but this isn't really made clear in the discussion. So let's just keep watching and I'll talk you through that a little bit more.
I have been attracted and seduced by the intellectual arguments of atheism and the people that espouse them. But that is more bleak than anything I've ever experienced, that idea.
Okay, so this is where the leap is made. So in one sentence, she's saying, fishing like her dad, that's an expression of spirituality. But in the next sentence, she's saying, I've been, the intellectual arguments of atheism, like atheism is nihilism, like those two things are equated with each other, which they absolutely aren't. Nihilism isn't necessarily connected to atheism. And this is the big issue I have with this conversation, is that now it's turned, nothing has meaning is equated with atheism.
Yeah, the dark certainty. For me, it's also faith. It's anti-faith faith.
Okay, so now Russel Brand is talking about the dark certainty. And as we just heard from in the interview with Brian Cox, that is absolutely not what he was arguing, and it's not what a lot of atheists argue. He does another interview with Ricky Gervais, and Ricky says the same thing. Atheism is not asserting itself as saying we are certain that God exists. Atheism is the lack of belief that God exists, as in acknowledging that we don't have the evidence, which people who are religious also acknowledge, right? Because in religion, there's this talk about the importance of faith, right? So both religion and science are acknowledging that there is this leap of faith that needs to be made in order to believe in a creator or a God of that kind. Now, we haven't talked about the fact that also God can be different things. One of the concepts that I'm a really big fan of is Hegel's God, where it's sort of like this belief in fulfilling your full potential, and that is what God is. But in this context, we're talking about the idea of an omnipotent being, like Russel Brand explains. And so this is where the conversation starts to kind of go in multiple directions. It's very easy for viewers to make the link between atheism and nihilism and lack of meaning and certainty, where that's not at all what atheism is actually asserting. And atheists who say, we have certainty, don't actually understand where atheism is coming from, because science and rationality and critical thinking shows us that we don't know.
It's the faith that we can determine, that we can understand, that with our observation of the patterns of material life on this planet, we can calculate, or even, the universe, with people that know about astrophysics, we can calculate the potentially limitless frequencies and dimensions that may exist. How can anyone make that judgment?
Well, who is making that judgment? Because Brian Cox didn't say that. So I don't understand who they are and what they are saying and how this sort of anti-faith has come about. Is that through some people making the argument on the internet? I mean, people make all sorts of arguments, but the actual philosophical argument of atheism is not about being certain. It's just saying that we don't have the proof to know. There is no knowledge. We don't have knowledge in this space, and we can't test things. We can't study it as scientists. We're not saying that we're certain that God or a creator doesn't exist.
And like you say, that it's so difficult to steer that away from nihilism. I know a lot of sort of atheists would say, well, if you need God in order to behave good, but I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it. I feel that it's basic and dumb to assume, like I was watching someone say the other day, Sadhguru, in fact, like that, like part of the instruments of your breathing are outside of your body. Without oxygen, that's it, game over. Your breathing apparatus requires an external force. Our cells are continually changing. My sense is this, that true transcendence is I can live beyond the idea that I'm an individual entity wrapped in this bag of skin and similarly you, and that there is some connection between us, that this is a temporary illusion. The individualism is a temporary illusion. The truth is that we are one, just points of attention experiencing this dimension, and that we will return to the oneness, that the consciousness that inhabits you and the consciousness that inhabits me is the very same consciousness, only refracted differently through the myriad material and experiential and biochemical differences. And that if we're heading back to that, then I can get to, even if you're in prison for pedophilia, that's what that person was doing the best they could with what they had, and the only thing we can do is forgive and love and sort of incarcerate and control.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ideas that Russel Brand talks through there. He doesn't finish the thought around it is basic and dumb, but I think where he was going with it, just based on what he was saying and the context of the argument, is that it's basic and dumb to assume that we know all these things that we can't know, which is exactly what atheists are saying. We don't know. The assumptions are made when you have a dogmatic belief in something. Russel Brand explains a little bit about his faith and what he believes in terms of, this returning to the oneness, which is absolutely, that's his prerogative. He can believe in that. And it's not necessarily not true, right? But it's not necessarily true either. I think one of the other things that is really important to be aware of is just because we want things to be a certain way doesn't mean that they are. Like if we think, oh, it'd be great if there was a creator, therefore I believe in a creator, that doesn't stand up to rational argument. There's lots of things we could want to believe, but it doesn't make them true. They aren't the necessary conditions for making something true or for making something knowledge. But there's nothing wrong with having a faith, like what Russell's saying, what he believes in. There's nothing wrong with that. We're just saying that in science we can't prove or disprove that. That's not in the space of what we're able to analyze and look at.
Yes, but you don't. First of all, I completely agree that it is a no faith theology. It is a gospel of no faith.
Okay, so again, I know I'm hammering home this point, but it's not a no faith theology. It's just an I don't know theology. So I think Brené Brown, again, is making a bit of a leap here. And like I said before, I'm a huge, huge fan of Brené Brown. I think many things that she says are amazing, but I think she needs to be aware of her biases here and also be aware that that is perhaps what some people are spouting and saying that they're atheists, but that isn't necessarily what atheism is philosophically or from a scientific perspective. For a lot of scientists who go, there just simply isn't the evidence. There is no faith behind that or dogma behind that. It is simply a matter of putting up a hand and saying, we don't know, we can't explore this, just like we can't explore whether or not the tooth fairy exists. We can't prove or disprove that. If you want to believe that, you can. You have the right to believe that, but we don't have the evidence to support that.
It is not any less dogmatic than the most fundamentalist. I mean, it is a theology.
Yeah.
Okay, so I really want to hear whether this is backed up or not, because I don't understand how it is a theology if we're saying that we don't know.
Often using straw men to fortify
Totally
itself.
straw men, yes. And, it's interesting because when I was in my MSW, I did a lot of domestic violence, sexual assault work. And the people, the women who believed that their husbands or partners were doing the best they could were the ones who left and got their children out.
Wow, because they know there's no,
Yeah.
So we've kind of jumped here again. Brené Brown doesn't really explain why she thinks it's a no faith theology. And, looking at what Brian Cox has said before, to me, I'm like, it's very clear that that isn't a theology. It is really throwing up her hands and saying, I don't know. And then she talks about sort of this, it's really important to believe that people are doing the best they can, which I don't understand why that has anything to do with atheism. Like, I believe people are doing the best they can because biologically and psychologically, and from what we understand about how the brain works and behavior patterns and all those kinds of things, yeah, I think people are doing the best they can. I don't see why we need to have belief in God to think that, which seems to be just the way she's linked those two ideas together, what she's arguing.
That
You know,
makes sense.
and they didn't say horrible sack of shit. They said, I love him. He's broken right now, and he's doing the best he can, and I'm not safe, and my kids are not safe.
In a sense, it's more fatalistic and more realistic. You know, like there doesn't need to be this odd alliance between being spiritually open and being crushed and pushed over and being I'm just
that's the boundary.
Okay, so they kind of finish this, you know, discussion around atheism, and they go on to talk about other things. But like I said, I think it's just really important to dissect that discussion a little bit, because there were a lot of ideas thrown around and kind of implicitly linked to one another without logical explanation of how those ideas might come together. So nihilism and atheism, they need to be treated as separate things. Some people are atheists and nihilists. Some people are atheists, would consider themselves spiritual and would be in awe of things like nature and humanity, and like Brian Cox and Ricky Gervais. And I'm the same. I'm like, yeah, it's amazing. How do we end up here? Isn't that incredible? What a fantastic mystery, right? But these ideas are kind of put all together. And then they actually use a strawman argument. So a strawman argument is when you kind of say like, oh, this is what this person believes, and now I'm going to argue it and attack it. And it's actually exactly what they do in that discussion. Russel Brand says, oh, it's certainty. And Brené Brown says it's dogma. And I'm like, who are you arguing against? Because atheism doesn't necessarily assert those things. Some people who call themselves atheists may do that. But the fact that Russel Brand referenced Brian Cox's discussion and Brian Cox didn't assert that, it's sort of like he used Brian Cox as the straw man, but he wasn't actually even saying those things. So they've kind of used a straw man argument and then criticized atheists for using straw man arguments, which I thought was, you know, very human. It's very normal. We all do it. We all have biases, and we all make irrational decisions and have irrational arguments. But it's just that it is asserted as a rational argument, and it's not. They've kind of said atheists believe in these things and have this dogma and do these things, and then they're arguing against that instead of actually going, let's have a chat with someone who's an atheist like Brian Cox, bring him in and have a chat with him about it. And I really think that those arguments wouldn't stand up by the very fact that Russel Brand has had these conversations, and, you know, Ricky Gervais, Brian Cox have said, like, yeah, we don't know. There is no certainty. Of course there's no certainty. You know, that's not how science works. Science never promises certainty. That's a really important thing to understand about it. This is my first video doing something like this. So if you do like it, let me know in the comments. If you don't, please be respectful. I'm happy to have discourse and discussion if you don't agree with me. But, you know, sort of dehumanizing language or calling people names, I don't think is the right way to go about it. And yeah, if you want to see more videos like this, let me know. Hit subscribe, and I'll talk to you again very soon.